Okay, so I want you to picture this scene. It's 1912.
Right.
You're standing on Ellis Island, and you see a man standing there, and he is declaring that roughly 80% of the exhausted immigrants stepping off these boats are biologically feeble-minded.
Which is just an absolutely staggering claim to make.
Right. I mean, he's making this sweeping, devastating judgment using a test that had been invented, like, just a few years earlier.
Yeah.
And the really bitter irony here is that this test was originally designed for the sole compassionate purpose of helping struggling school children in Paris.
It really is a tragedy.
It is. So today we are looking at how a tool of compassion was basically weaponized. We've got this massive stack of source material, a comprehensive dossier of historical records, psychological studies, sociological analyses.
Tons of data.
Yeah, tons of it. And our mission for this deep dive is to trace the truly tragic evolution of the IQ test.
Exactly. Because we are really tracking the mutation of a scientific idea here. To understand the explosive debates around intelligence and race, especially, the ones that erupted later in the 20th century, we have to establish a very careful foundation.
We really do.
So our goal for this deep dive is to impartially examine the historical and scientific record that's in our sources. We're going to report on the facts of how early American researchers took a simple diagnostic tool and just bent it toward these incredibly rigid hereditary conclusions.
Yeah, bent it completely out of shape.
But to evaluate any of those really explosive claims, you, the listener, first need to understand what an IQ score actually is. And crucially, what it definitely is not.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the scene at Ellis Island is, well, it's just staggering when you really try to visualize it.
It really paints a picture.
It does. I mean, imagine you have just spent weeks in the belly of a steamship. You have crossed the Atlantic Ocean, leaving behind everything you have ever known.
Just a brutal journey.
Brutal. The air down in steerage was thick, the food was scarce, the anxiety was probably absolutely crushing, and then you step off onto the dock. You are completely surrounded by this cacophony of languages, Hungarian, Russian, Italian, Yiddish.
Chaos.
Total chaos. There's shouting, the confusion of the customs lines, the sheer physical toll of the journey itself. You're just trying to keep your family together.
Right.
And waiting for you, standing amidst this sea of traumatized humanity, is an American psychologist named Henry Goddard.
And he's got a clipboard.
He has a clipboard.
Look.
And he isn't there to offer medical care or a welcome packet. He pulls you aside.
Yeah, through these really hurried interpreters, he administers this brief, strange, cognitive assessment.
Right.
And based on just a few minutes of interaction with people who've literally just stepped off a boat into a foreign land, he concludes that the vast majority of Jewish, Hungarian, Italian, and Russian immigrants' tests are intellectually deficient.
It's just wild.
It is. And it's a number that would go on to shape the demographic destiny of the United States in ways we are honestly still untangling today.
I am just stuck on the profound absurdity of that interaction. I mean, he is testing non-English speakers fresh off a transatlantic boat who are completely unfamiliar with American cultural norms.
It makes no logical sense.
None. But, tools mutate when they change hands. To figure out how Goddard ended up on that dock in the first place, we have to travel backward in time and look at where this test actually came from.
We have to go to Paris.
Yes, to Paris.
Yeah.
The year is 1904. The French Ministry of Public Instruction is facing a very practical, very administrative problem.
Right. They have this massive school population.
Exactly.
And within that population, they have a mix of children who are struggling. But they're struggling for fundamentally different reasons.
Yeah, because it's never just one issue.
Exactly. You have children with genuine intellectual disabilities, but you also have children who are perfectly capable but have simply been very poorly taught.
Which happens all the time.
Right. And you have children whose behavior is disruptive for entirely unrelated reasons, maybe extreme poverty or trouble at home.
So the classrooms are crowded, the teachers are overwhelmed, and they just need a way to figure out who actually needs specialized help.
They aren't looking to create a biological hierarchy.
No, not at all. They just want to know who needs to be in a different educational program so they aren't just sitting in the back of the room being neglected.
Right.
So they commission a psychologist named Alfred Binet, who teams up with Theodore Simon to build a tool for this exact, highly localized task.
And in 1905, they published the result, which is the Binet-Simon scale.
Mm-hmm.
It is widely considered the founding document of intelligence testing.
And the key innovation here is Well, what they brought to the table was the concept of mental age,
Yes.
which was a completely novel way of looking at cognitive development at the time. It wasn't about ranking kids on some permanent scale of human worth. It was about creating a snapshot of current performance.
Exactly. So if you have a 10-year-old child,
Okay.
but they're performing at the level typical of an 8-year-old, their mental age is 8.
Right.
That 2-year gap is simply a flag.
Yeah.
It suggests to the teacher, this child might benefit from some additional support and intervention.
I was looking through the actual tasks Binet and Simon designed in our dossier, and they are just so pragmatic.
Very down to earth.
Yeah, it wasn't some mystical probe into the soul. There were 30 tasks of graded difficulty. At the easy end, it was things like following a moving light with your eyes or being able to point to different parts of your body when the examiner asks.
Very basic functional stuff.
Exactly. Then, as you move up the scale, it gets a bit more complex. It involved defining abstract words or reasoning through a social situation. It was basically just a grab bag of cognitive challenges designed to see where a kid currently stood relative to their peers.
And Binet was explicitly, forcefully clear about what his scale was and what it was not.
This is so important.
It is. And this is the piece of history that gets tragically paved over. He explicitly criticized what he called la notion de l'intelligence, fixed the notion of fixed intelligence.
He hated that idea.
He really did. He argued that his test did not measure a unitary, single thing inside the brain. He was simply sampling tasks as a practical proxy for current ability.
He literally wrote warnings about this. He said, do not use this test to say a child is permanently incapable.
Right.
He believed that scores could change with time, with different environmental circumstances, and with better teaching. He viewed intelligence as something that could be cultivated almost like a muscle.
Which is completely contrary to how it ended up being used. He worried presciently that the instrument he built out of compassion could be weaponized.
He saw it coming.
He knew human nature. He feared it could be used to label children with an unchangeable biological destiny rather than identifying them for help. And tragically, within just a decade of his death, that exact nightmare scenario materialized. But not in France.
No, it happened in the United States. Which brings us back to Henry Goddard.
That's right.
It's around 1908. Goddard is an American psychologist and the director of research at a training school for, quote-unquote, fetal-minded children in New Jersey.
And he discovers Binet's test.
He does. He translates the Binet-Simon scale into English and begins distributing it massively across the United States. Our sources estimate he distributed something like 22,000 copies of this translated test.
Which is a huge reach for that era. And this is the moment of the great hijacking. Goddard embraces two core beliefs that Binet had explicitly rejected.
Okay, what were they?
First, Goddard believed that the test score actually did measure a unitary, fixed intellectual capacity, like a physical property of the brain.
Even though Binet specifically said it doesn't.
Exactly. Second, he believed that this capacity was almost 100% heritable, passed down immutably through bloodlines. Goddard took Binet's diagnostic flexible snapshot of a child's current learning state, and he forged it into a permanent biological life sentence.
Okay, wait, I have to push back here, or at least express my genuine confusion. Goddard translates Binet's test. He literally translates and reads the warnings Binet wrote.
Yeah, he had to have read them.
Right. So was it deliberate malice on Goddard's part, or did he genuinely believe his framework was somehow improving Binet's work? I mean, how does a scientist just ignore the creator of the instrument he's using?
You have to look at the ideological framework Goddard was operating within. Goddard was thoroughly steeped in the eugenics movement.
Okay.
Eugenics at the time was not considered a fringe pseudoscience. It was a mainstream, highly influential movement embraced by academics, politicians, and social reformers.
It was basically everywhere.
It was. The core belief of eugenics was that human society could be scientifically improved by encouraging the reproduction of people with desirable traits and discouraging or preventing the reproduction of those with undesirable traits. It basically applied the logic of agricultural animal breeding to human populations.
So Goddard is already wearing these eugenics-tinted glasses. When he looks at human variation, he is primed to see it as innate and hereditary.
Exactly. To Goddard, if a child scores poorly on this translated test, it's not because they had a bad teacher or were hungry that morning or were scared of the examiner.
It's because they have fundamentally flawed genetic material.
That was his conclusion. He actually expanded Binet's clinical categories to reflect this rigid biological hierarchy. He introduced a new term to the medical lexicon, the moron.
Wow.
Yeah, it comes from the Greek word moronia, meaning foolish. Goddard slotted this new category into an existing hierarchy.
How did that hierarchy work?
So if your IQ score was roughly between 51 and 70, you were a moron. Below that, an IQ of 26 to 50, you were an imbecile. And from 0 to 25, you were an idiot.
And these weren't just insults back then, they were actual medical diagnoses.
Yes, and he did not present these as fluid, temporary educational states like Binet would have. He presented them as permanent biological types, fixed by heredity, entirely unchangeable by any amount of education, and crucially, a threat to the genetic stock of the nation if those individuals reproduced.
And he tried to prove this scientifically. I'm looking at his 1912 study from the dossier, the Kallikak family. It's presented as this rigorous genealogical study tracing feeble-mindedness through a multi-generational family line.
Yeah.
But the methodology, calling it appalling feels like an understatement.
By any modern standard of peer review, it is a total farce. Goddard used untrained field workers. These workers would travel to rural towns, interview relatives, and make snap, subjective judgments about the intelligence of both living and dead individuals based entirely on town gossip, hearsay, and physical appearance.
Wait, physical appearance?
Yes. They would look at a photograph of an ancestor and declare them feeble-minded based on the shape of their jaw.
That's completely wild. It's essentially scientific fan fiction, yet at the time it was wildly popular, right?
Yeah. It's very popular.
It was read by the public and policymakers as hard empirical evidence that intellectual limitation was a hereditary taint that would ruin the country if left unchecked.
Which perfectly explains Goddard's mindset when he steps onto Ellis Island. He brings that entire eugenic framework to the docks.
Right.
He tests recent arrivals who have just endured a grueling ocean crossing, who are terrified of being deported, who do not speak English, and who have zero familiarity with the American cultural context embedded in the translated test.
A completely stacked deck.
And when they predictably perform poorly, Goddard doesn't acknowledge the environment or the glaring flaws in his methodology. He looks at the low scores and sees exactly what he expected to see: innate biological destiny.
It is a classic case of what our sources highlight, the predictable output of a biased tool applied entirely without controls. But, Goddard wasn't acting in a vacuum.
No, he wasn't.
As he is standing on a dock labeling immigrants, the mathematical architecture that would make this rigid ranking seem incredibly scientific and objective was being built across the ocean in Britain. Binet built the test, Goddard supplied the eugenics, but a man named Charles Spearman supplied the math.
We have to shift the timeline slightly here to 1904. Charles Spearman, a British psychologist and statistician, publishes a paper in the American Journal of Psychology that will shape intelligence research for the next century.
So what was his breakthrough?
Spearman was observing schoolchildren, and he noticed a very specific statistical phenomenon. He looked at children's grades across school subjects that seemed completely unrelated: classical languages, mathematics, music, physical education.
And what he found was that kids who were good at one thing tended to be good at everything else.
Exactly.
Like the kid who aces the math test also tends to do pretty well in French class and maybe even holds their own on the soccer field. And the kid who really struggles with reading might also struggle with arithmetic.
Spearman called this observation the positive manifold. The scores across diverse, seemingly unrelated cognitive tasks are positively correlated. If you graph them out, they move together.
Okay, that makes sense on a basic level.
To explain this mathematically, Spearman proposed what became known as the two-factor theory of intelligence. He argued that every time you perform a cognitive task, your performance is driven by two distinct things. First, there are specific factors, which he called S.
Meaning specific to the task.
Yes, these are the unique, localized skills needed for that specific task. If you're doing a crossword puzzle, your S factor is your vocabulary and spelling ability.
But there is a second factor.
Right. The second factor is a general factor, which he called G. Spearman hypothesized that G is a common underlying cognitive resource that you draw upon for all mental tasks.
Oh, I see.
Whether you are doing algebra, defining a word, solving a spatial puzzle, or memorizing a list, you are dipping into this exact same well of general intelligence.
And he didn't just propose this as an armchair philosophy. He basically invented the math to isolate it.
He did.
And I really need to visualize this because if I hear the phrase matrix of correlations, my eyes immediately glaze over.
How did Spearman actually pull a general factor out of a bunch of noisy school grades?
Okay, think of evaluating a decathlon athlete. A decathlon consists of 10 wildly different events: sprinting, shot put, high jump, pole vault, the 1,500-meter run.
Right.
The skills required for the shot put are very different from the skills required to run a mile. Those are the specific factors, the S.
Because being big and strong helps with the shot put, but being light and lean helps with the mile.
Exactly. But if you look at the scores of hundreds of athletes across all 10 events, you will notice a trend. The athletes who do well in the shot put also tend to do better than average in the sprint and the high jump. There is a common thread.
Because they possess a general underlying athletic ability, like general fitness, explosiveness, central nervous system efficiency. Exactly. Factor analysis, which is the mathematical method Spearman developed, is essentially a complex algorithm that looks at all those individual event scores. It filters out the specific skills, like the technique for throwing the shot put, and mathematically isolates that common denominator of general athleticism.
That's fascinating.
So in cognitive testing, factor analysis looks at scores from math tests, vocabulary tests, and logic puzzles, filters out the specific knowledge, and isolates G, the general intelligence factor.
Okay, here is where it gets incredibly important. Our sources draw a massive glowing line around this concept, and we need to be very clear about it. Spearman's G is real.
Very real.
It is a highly reliable statistical construct. The data shows that G accounts for roughly 40 to 50% of the variance in performance across a broad battery of cognitive tests. It has immense predictive power in the real world.
It does.
It reliably predicts academic achievement and job performance in a wide variety of fields. The math absolutely works. And this is the distinction that early researchers completely botched. G is a statistical descriptor. It is not a discrete biological structure.
Right. Even today, well over a century later, the brain does not contain a genome module. You cannot put someone in an fMRI machine, point to a specific lobe, and say, there is the G center.
It's not a physical thing you can touch?
No, it is a mathematical factor extracted from a correlation matrix. It is a way of describing patterns and test scores on a piece of paper. Now, what biological processes actually underlie this positive manifold? Is it neural efficiency? Is it the speed of processing in the prefrontal cortex? Is it general brain health? That is still an active, fiercely debated question in neuroscience.
It's exactly like a batting average in baseball. A batting average is a highly reliable statistical construct. It predicts how well a player will do next season with incredible accuracy.
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it.
But you can't cut open a baseball player and find their batting average organ. It's a summary of performance, an abstraction, not a physical entity.
That is a perfect analogy. And this is where the historical tragedy really compounds. The fatal leap that early hereditarian researchers made was reification. They treated an abstract concept as if it were a concrete physical thing.
They made it solid in their minds.
Yes. They took a mathematical summary of test performance, assumed it was a physical, biological entity lodged in the brain, and then assumed that this entity was distributed unevenly across different races and ethnicities by heredity.
Wow.
They went from saying these two groups differ on a statistical measure of G to declaring these two groups differ genetically in innate cognitive capacity. That is the massive logical failure our source material aims to deconstruct.
So if G is just a statistical descriptor, and Binet's test was originally just a flexible snapshot of a kid's current learning, how did these two ideas merge to literally shape American law?
That's the real question.
How did we get from a classroom in Paris to determining who is legally allowed into the United States? This brings us to the massive industrial-scale expansion of IQ testing in the U.S. The two main architects of this expansion are Louis Terman and Robert Yerkes.
Let's start with Terman at Stanford University. The year is 1916. Terman takes Goddard's English translation of the Binet-Simon scale and radically overhauls it.
Okay, so he's building on Goddard's work.
Right. He extends the age range. He tested on about 3,000 American children to create standardized norms, and he renames it the Stanford Binet Intelligence Test. This is the moment the term intelligence quotient, or IQ, enters the mainstream.
Ah, so that's where IQ comes from.
Originally, it was a literal quotient, mental age, divided by chronological age, multiplied by 100.
So Terman builds the test that becomes the absolute gold standard in American schools. If you took an IQ test in the 20th century, you likely took some descendant of Terman's work. But what he does with the test is where the plot is completely lost.
Terman publishes a book in 1916 called The Measurement of Intelligence. Our sources describe it as half technical manual, half hereditarian manifesto.
Yikes.
Terman applies his shiny new Stanford Binet test to Mexican-American and Black children living in the Southwest, and he finds that their average scores are lower than the white children he tested.
Okay, but any reasonable scientist looking at that data in 1916 would immediately see the massive confounding variables. I mean, did he stop to ask, hey, maybe these children are scoring lower because they are dealing with crushing poverty? Or because English isn't their primary language at home? Or maybe because their schools are chronically underfunded and heavily segregated?
He dismisses those incredibly obvious environmental variables entirely.
Of course he does.
Instead, Terman concludes that their lower scores reflect an innate biological racial inferiority. He wrote in published scientific literature that these lower scores were racial, or at least inherent in the family stocks from which they come.
That is just sickening to read.
He argued they couldn't master abstractions, that they should be tracked into menial labor, and that they constituted a massive eugenic problem.
It is jarring to hear those words applied to a tool that Binet invented to help struggling kids. As the sources point out, impartially looking at the data, that isn't a scientific conclusion. Terman didn't control for schooling, language, or poverty.
Not at all.
That is a political ideology dressed up in the language of objective science. He started with the cultural assumption that these groups were inferior, and he weaponized his new tool to prove it.
Terman was highly influential, serving as a leader in multiple eugenics organizations. But if Terman brought the IQ test to the American schoolhouse, Robert Yerkes brought it to the entire nation on an unprecedented scale.
Right, because right after Terman publishes his book, America enters World War I. Robert Yerkes, who is the president of the American Psychological Association, sees an opportunity.
He does.
He goes to the military brass and says, "You have a massive influx of recruits. I have a scientific tool to help you sort them. I can tell you who should be an officer, who should be an infantryman, and who should be discharged."
Between 1917 and 1918, Yerkes orchestrates the largest single cognitive testing enterprise in human history up to that point. He oversees the administration of two tests, the Army Alpha and the Army Beta.
What's the difference between them?
The Army Alpha was a written exam designed for literate English-speaking recruits. The Army Beta was a pictorial exam using pictures, mazes, and symbols designed for recruits who were illiterate or didn't speak English. Ultimately, they tested approximately 1.75 million men.
The sheer logistics of testing 1.75 million men in crowded military camps are mind-boggling. And I want to dig into the actual content of these tests because it perfectly illustrates the bias we are talking about.
It really does.
The Army Alpha, the written test, asked questions that required deep, localized American cultural knowledge. It would ask things like, Crisco is a patent medicine, disinfectant, toothpaste, or food product.
Which is just a trivia question.
Yeah. Or it would ask you to identify the names of American advertising mascots.
If you are a young man who grew up on a remote farm in Appalachia or a recent immigrant, you might be a mechanical genius, but you aren't going to know what Crisco is if it's not sold in your local general store.
Exactly. And the Army Beta, which was explicitly designed for people who couldn't read English, was just as bad. It relied on pictorials that assumed you were highly familiar with urban, middle-class American life.
Right.
You'd have to identify what was missing from a picture of a phonograph or a tennis court. If you grew up in a rural village in Eastern Europe, you have never seen a tennis court.
And the conditions under which these tests were administered were incredibly stressful. Men were packed into massive halls, often anxious, intimidated by the military authority. The instructions for the Army Beta were sometimes pantomimed by examiners who were rushing to get through thousands of men a day.
It is like judging someone's innate biological athleticism based entirely on their ability to play a sport they've literally never seen before, using a rule book written in a language they don't speak.
That's exactly what it is.
And when they fumble the ball, you write down on your clipboard that they lack the sports gene. It is a logically bankrupt methodology.
Yet, the real-world consequences of this logically bankrupt process were devastating. Yerkes and his colleagues took this mountain of data from 1.75 million men and they analyzed it to produce a strict national hierarchy.
What did they claim?
They claimed the data proved empirically that white Americans were innately superior to black Americans. Furthermore, they created a detailed ethnic hierarchy within the white population. They claimed men of Northern and Western European descent, the so-called Nordic types, were biologically superior to recent immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, like Italians, Greeks, and Russians.
But the data was actually screaming a completely different story, wasn't it? If you look past the racist assumptions and just look at the raw numbers.
It absolutely was. The data tracked acculturation and educational access, not genetics. Years later, scientists analyzing this exact same data set pointed out glaring, undeniable contradictions.
Like what?
For example, black military recruits from several northern states consistently outscored white recruits from several southern states.
Let that sink in. Northern black recruits living in a society plagued by systemic racism were still scoring higher on average than Southern white recruits.
Yep.
If intelligence is a rigid, innate racial hierarchy, like Yerkes claimed, that result makes zero sense.
But if test scores reflect years spent in better-funded schools, familiarity with the English language, and integration into the dominant American culture which northern black recruits had more access to than rural southern white recruits at that time, then the result makes perfect sense.
It's all about the environment.
Yes. The tests were measuring education, environment, and cultural exposure, not innate racial biology.
But the architects of the American eugenics movement didn't care about the environmental explanation. They had the data they wanted.
In the years following World War I, there was a massive nativist anti-immigrant push in the United States. Politicians were looking for a way to restrict immigration from non-Nordic countries.
And they used Yerkes data.
They did. The architects of that push used Yerkes Army data as their scientific battering ram. This supposedly objective data was heavily cited in congressional hearings. Experts testified that Southern and Eastern Europeans were diluting the national intelligence. The direct legislative result of this pseudoscientific lobbying was the Immigration Act of 1924, also known as the Johnson-Reed Act.
This law fundamentally reshaped the demographics of America. It sharply curtailed immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, the exact populations Goddard and Yerkes had labeled inferior, and it effectively banned most Asian immigration altogether.
It's incredible how far it went.
We went from Alfred Binet trying to figure out which Parisian kids needed a tutor to the United States Congress passing sweeping, racially restrictive immigration laws based on a profound misunderstanding of test scores.
And all of these American researchers, Goddard, Terman, Yerkes, were relying on a single, profoundly misunderstood concept to justify their claims. A concept that sounds highly technical, highly scientific, but is incredibly easy to misuse.
The word is heritability.
Yeah.
To understand exactly why the conclusions of these early IQ pioneers were completely scientifically invalid, we have to look under the hood of that word. We are going to take this section very carefully because it is the core misunderstanding at the heart of this entire deep dive.
It really is the key to all of this.
If you understand heritability, the whole race and IQ argument unravels completely. So I want you, the listener, to momentarily forget everything you think you know about the word genetic. Let's start with a blank slate. What is the correct technical definition of heritability, which is usually written out in statistics as Cheeks squared?
Let's build the definition from the ground up, because the colloquial use of the word ruins our understanding of the science. Heritability is not a description of a single person.
Okay, that's step one.
Right? You do not have a heritability score. It is a ratio. It is a population-level statistic. The precise definition is this div. Heritability is the proportion of the observed variation in a trait among individuals in a particular population at a particular time in a particular environment that is statistically associated with genetic differences among those individuals.
Okay, if I read a study that says IQ is 50% heritable, my brain immediately thinks, okay, half of my intelligence comes from my parents' genes and the other half comes from my environment. Why is that fundamentally wrong?
Because you are applying a population statistic to an individual. It does not mean your personal intelligence is a 50-50 split.
Okay.
It means that if you look at the total spread of IQ scores in that specific group of people they studied, under those specific environmental conditions, roughly half of the differences, the variance between the individuals in that group, can be linked to genetic differences.
Right.
The other half of the variation in scores is associated with environmental differences, things like how good their schools were, their childhood nutrition, their family stress levels, test prep, everything else.
So it's strictly about explaining the variation within a specific group. Our dossier lays out 3 specific things that heritability does not mean. These are the traps that Goddard and Terman fell right into. Let's walk through them. Number 1, what is the first thing heritability does not mean?
First, High heritability does not mean a trait is genetically fixed or unchangeable by the environment. People hear the phrase highly heritable and they instantly think destiny. That is entirely false.
The best analogy for this is human height. Height is highly heritable. Tall parents tend to have tall kids, short parents tend to have short kids.
Politically.
The heritability of height is very high, often estimated around 80%. But over the last 100 years, the average height of human populations across the globe has surged dramatically. People are way taller today than they were in 1924.
Human genetics did not mutate in a century. Evolution doesn't work that fast.
No, it doesn't.
What changed was the environment. We got better nutrition, better public health, widespread vaccines, less stunting from childhood disease. The genetic potential for height was always there in the population, but the environment improved sufficiently to allow that potential to be fully expressed.
The exact same logic applies to IQ scores. Just because IQ has a high heritability estimate doesn't mean it's locked in stone. Programs like Head Start and early childhood interventions have repeatedly demonstrated that you can boost IQ scores by enriching the environment. A high heritability score does not preclude environmental improvement.
Which brings us to the second trap. Heritability is not a fixed property of a trait itself. It is not a universal constant like the speed of light. It is entirely dependent on the environment you are measuring it in.
Explain how the environment changes the math.
Let's imagine an extreme utopian scenario. Imagine a society where every single child is raised in the exact same environment.
Okay, a perfect utopia.
Right. They all get the exact same perfectly nutritious meals, the exact same brilliant teachers, the exact same amount of sleep, the exact same educational resources. In that perfectly uniform environment, the environmental variation drops to zero.
Because there are no differences in their environment.
Exactly. So what happens to heritability? It skyrockets to 100%. Because if the environment is identical for everyone, the only thing left to explain any differences in their test scores is their genetics.
But reality doesn't look like that.
Not at all.
If you take those same kids and put them in a society with massive inequality, some go to elite private academies with personal tutors, and others go to crumbling, underfunded schools while dealing with food insecurity and lead paint suddenly, the environment is having a massive impact on the variation in their scores. The environmental variance goes way up, so the genetic heritability number goes way down.
Precisely. You cannot take a heritability estimate calculated on a group of white middle-class European twins in 1950 and apply that number to a completely different population living in a completely different set of social conditions. The number is not quotable. It is deeply tied to the context in which it was measured.
Okay, so it doesn't mean fixed destiny, and it's not a universal constant. But here is the third thing heritability does not mean. Our sources flag this as the absolute most critical point. This is the logic bomb that destroys the entire hereditarian argument used to justify racial hierarchies.
The third point is this. High heritability within a group tells you absolutely nothing about the causes of differences between groups.
I want to repeat that because it is the linchpin of this entire deep dive. High heritability within one group says nothing, mathematically, logically, scientifically nothing about why there is a difference in average scores between two different groups.
This is the exact error Arthur Jensen makes in 1969. And it's the error Terman and Yerkes made before him. To illustrate why this is a fatal logical fallacy, we have to look at a famous thought experiment designed by the Harvard population geneticist Richard Lewontin. It's known as the seeds and soil experiment.
Let's paint this picture vividly. Imagine I have a massive handful of corn seeds. This is a very genetically diverse handful of seeds.
Okay, lots of variety.
Yes, some have genes to grow tall, some have genes to grow short, some are right in the middle. I take this big handful and I just randomly divide it in half. Because the division is totally random, batch A and batch B are, on average, genetically identical. There is no systemic genetic difference between the two batches.
That is the setup. Now you take batch A and you plant it in an incredibly rich, well-watered, perfectly fertilized field. You take batch B and you plant it in a field with poor, depleted soil, terrible drainage, and not enough sunlight.
Let's look at the rich field first. When those batch A plants grow up, some are taller than others. Why? Well, they all had the exact same perfect soil, the same water, the same sun. The environment was uniform. Therefore, any variation in height within that rich field is almost entirely due to the genetic differences between the individual seeds.
Exactly.
The within-group heritability is very high.
And the exact same statistical phenomenon happens in the poor field. Batch B grows up stunted and small because the soil's terrible.
Mm-hmm.
But within that poor field, some plants are slightly taller than others.
Right, because there's genetic variety in that batch, too.
Since they all suffered the exact same terrible soil, the variation within the poor field is also mostly genetic. The within-group heritability in the poor field is also very high.
We have two fields, both with high heritability within them, and here's the million-dollar question. Why is the average height of the rich field so much taller than the average height of the poor field?
The answer is 100% environmental. It is entirely because of the soil. There was zero genetic difference between the two batches of seeds to begin with, remember. The random sorting guaranteed that.
So how does Lewontin's seed analogy map onto human populations and IQ testing?
It maps perfectly onto the sociological reality of the 20th century. Substitute corn seeds for human populations. If you have two groups of humans, say, a socially dominant group and a historically marginalized group,
Okay.
both groups are raised in systematically different environments. They have different levels of funding for their schools, different levels of generational wealth, different exposure to environmental toxins, different levels of chronic social stress, and different cultural alignment with the arbitrary questions written on an IQ test.
One group is planted in the rich soil, one group is planted in the depleted soil.
Exactly. You might find that IQ scores have a high heritability within the advantaged group, and you might find high heritability within the marginalized group. But if you see a difference in the average test score between the two groups, you cannot use that within group heritability to claim the gap is genetic.
Because it doesn't tell you anything about the soil.
Right. The difference between the groups could be entirely 100% environmental. High within group heritability does not distinguish between the gap is genetic and the gap is environmental. It is mathematically and logically silent on the question.
When early researchers looked at the gap in scores between white Americans and black Americans, or native-born citizens and new immigrants, and said, well, intelligence is highly heritable, so this gap must be genetic, they were looking at the stunted corn in the depleted soil and blaming the seeds.
They were completely ignoring the soil. They were conflating within-group variance with between-group variance. It is a fundamental statistical error, but it was an error that perfectly suited the social prejudices of the time. It gave a veneer of mathematical inevitability to social inequality.
As we move forward in the timeline, this profound scientific flaw, coupled with the horrifying extremes to which eugenics was ultimately taken, caused the global scientific community to attempt to definitively shut this entire debate down.
The timeline shifts to the post-World War II era. The horrors of the Holocaust made racial science politically and morally toxic on a global scale.
For very good reason.
The Nazi eugenics program, which had actually borrowed heavily from the theories and sterilization laws championed by American eugenicists, had culminated in genocide. This permanently discredited the concept of scientific racism in the eyes of international institutions. Formal eugenics organizations in the U.S. quietly shuttered or changed their names. The most vocal hereditarian figures either retired or faded from public view.
The world realized that classifying human beings into biological hierarchies of worth inevitably leads to catastrophe. The United Nations steps in to formally close the door on this dark chapter of science.
In 1950, UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, convened an international panel of social scientists. This panel included eminent sociologists, psychologists, and anthropologists.
A really heavy-hitting group.
Very much so. Their mandate was to review the science and issue a definitive statement on race. The resulting document was simply titled, The Race Question.
It was unequivocal. They declared that race was not so much a biological phenomenon as a social myth. They stated clearly that there was no scientific justification for treating race as a hierarchy of intellectual or moral worth.
To be historically accurate to our sources, that 1950 statement did provoke some criticism from physical scientists and geneticists.
Oh, really? Why?
Well, they felt the anthropologists had leaned too heavily on social politics and understated the reality of biological variation in human populations, things like blood types, bone density, or disease resistance. So in 1951, UNESCO issued a revised statement with greater input from geneticists.
So they walked it back.
Not exactly. The 1951 version was more measured about biological variation, but it firmly maintained the central conclusion: human populations do vary genetically in minor ways, but there is absolutely no evidence that these variations correlate with innate intelligence, and no scientific basis for ranking human groups.
By the early 1950s, the global scientific institutions agreed. The science was settled. The racial ranking project of the early 20th century was unsupported and dangerous. Which brings us to the most whiplash-inducing moment of our deep dive.
There you go.
If the science was settled and the global institutions agreed, what blew the doors off this debate again? Why did Arthur Jensen, an educational psychologist at UC Berkeley, publish a massive 123-page article in the Harvard Educational Review in 1969 claiming that the black-white IQ gap was largely genetic?
To understand why Jensen's article detonated with such force, you have to understand the socio-political accelerant that had been pooling on the floor throughout the 1960s. The UNESCO statements were declarations, but they weren't laws.
Right.
And by 1969, there were three massive intersecting pressures that made the reopening of this question incredibly charged.
Let's look at the backdrop. Pressure number one, the Cold War.
Post-war, America is trying to present itself as the leader of the free world, a beacon of democracy and equality against Soviet communism. But this self-presentation is in direct tension with America's domestic racial order.
Because segregation was still a huge issue.
Exactly. Segregation was the law of the land in much of the country. The Civil Rights Movement was exposing this hypocrisy to the world. The Soviet Union was literally broadcasting images of American lynchings, segregated water fountains, and police dogs attacking peaceful protesters as global propaganda.
That's intense.
There was immense geopolitical pressure on U.S. institutions to demonstrate they were making progress on race. In this environment, any scientific claim that seemed to naturalize racial hierarchy wasn't just an academic paper, it carried massive geopolitical weight.
Pressure number two, and this is the big one on the domestic front, Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 and the ferocious battles over school desegregation.
Brown v. Board ruled that racially segregated public schools were unconstitutional. It set in motion the most significant restructuring of American public education since the Civil War.
Right.
But by 1969, we are 15 years into the enforcement of that ruling. And it has been 15 years of violent, ferocious white resistance. Think of Little Rock, the Freedom Riders, the massive political battles over busing.
So everything is already boiling over.
Yes. The question of what integrated schools could accomplish for black children was not an abstract psychological theory. It was the most hotly contested, live political question in the nation.
That leads directly to pressure number three, President Lyndon B. Johnson's war on poverty, and specifically the launch of the Head Start program in 1965.
Head Start was the ultimate expression of the environmental hypothesis. The government looked at the data showing gaps in school readiness between disadvantaged and advantaged children, and they said, this is an environmental problem.
Right. They saw the bad soil and wanted to fix it.
Exactly. They said, this is about early childhood experience, resources, and nutrition. If we intervene early and change the environment, we can close the gap.
Head Start had been running for just 4 years when Jensen dropped his paper in 1969. How did Jensen actually open that paper?
Jensen's opening line essentially claimed that compensatory education, meaning programs like Head Start, had been tried and they had failed.
Wow, just 4 years in.
Yeah. He argued that the intervention didn't permanently close the IQ gap. He then made his central argumentative move. He cited the high heritability of IQ. Remember the seeds in the soil? And he used that within group heritability to argue that the gap between black and white students was substantially genetic.
He went right back to the same trap.
He argued that Head Start failed because you cannot socially engineer away genetic limits.
As we just proved exhaustively with the Lamontan seed analogy, Jensen's use of heritability to make that claim was logically invalid. It was the exact same mathematical fallacy that Terman and Yerkes made. High within-group heritability tells you nothing about between-group differences.
Logically invalid, yes, but rhetorically and politically. It was a lit match in a room full of gasoline. To people resisting desegregation, to people opposed to the federal spending of the war on poverty, Jensen's paper offered a scientific justification for inequality.
It gave them an excuse.
It provided a respectable academic veneer to the argument that structural inequality wasn't the fault of society, but simply the natural order of biology. It was exactly what Binet had feared, weaponized for the political battles of the late 1960s.
Let's bring this all together. The tragic arc detailed in these sources is incredibly clear. Alfred Binet built a flashlight. He built a practical diagnostic tool to find children in the dark who needed extra help from their teachers.
A completely noble goal.
Within just a few decades, American researchers took that flashlight and turned it into a rigid biological caste system. They backed it up with statistical misunderstandings of Spearman's G and the concept of heritability, and they used it to fundamentally reshape American immigration law and brand entire populations as genetically inferior.
We must emphasize again, as our sources do, that the predictive validity of IQ tests for academic and job performance is a real, uncontested scientific fact. The tests measure something real about cognitive performance in our society.
We aren't denying the math.
No. But the leap from this test predicts school performance to this test measures innate permanent racial worth is a gross misapplication of the data. It is a classic textbook case of starting with a prejudiced conclusion in this case, the eugenic belief in racial hierarchy, and then frantically searching for the evidence to support it while entirely ignoring the environmental context.
It is looking at the stunted corn and blaming the seed while ignoring the toxic soil. I want you to picture those exhausted immigrants again, standing in front of Henry Goddard in 1912. They are being judged as fundamentally biologically inferior because they don't know the cultural trivia of a country they have literally just set foot in. It seems obvious to us now how ridiculous, how deeply flawed that metric was.
It really does.
But I want to leave you with this thought to mull over long after this deep dive ends. If the smartest scientific minds of the early 20th century could look at a heavily biased test of American cultural trivia and genuinely mistake it for an objective measure of permanent, innate human worth, what metrics are we using today? What standardized tests, algorithmic hiring assessments, or performance reviews are we using right now in our schools and workplaces that we falsely believe are measuring fixed, innate potential, when in reality, they might just be measuring the soil we were planted in?